our thesis is that rich expectations posited by anticipatory views of perception to account for perceptual content can explain that at least some high-level aesthetic properties feature in perceptual experience. Part of our view is that aesthetic and non-aesthetic cases are distinguished by the precise role played by our imaginative capacities. So while in non-aesthetic cases, current sensory stimuli plays a more determinant role, in the aesthetic case, these stimuli serve only as an anchor for the experience, and our imaginative capacities are given more free rein. So the plan is the following. In the following section, we will introduce the challenge faced by aesthetic perceptualism. In section 3, we will offer a characterization of aesthetic properties. We will then move on to the anticipatory approaches to perception as our basis for an argument for aesthetic perceptualism. In section 5, we will finally apply these views to the case of aesthetic properties. And in the final section, we will offer some concluding remarks. Okay, so let's turn now to the challenge for aesthetic perceptualism. Perceptualism, as I said, refers to the view that at least some high-level properties can feature in the contents of, or they can be represented in perceptual experience. Perceptualism is concerned with properties that are not only represented in some visual process, but that are also associated with a certain phenomenology. Now, to start off, we will take a look at some features of Susanna Siegel's contrast argument. And because we're interested in showing how a contrast argument motivates aesthetic perceptualism. So Siegel's defense of perceptualism depends on a minimal and arguably unproblematic intuition about an overall difference in the phenomenology when considering these two cases, right? So for example, the change in the experience of seeing a page written in Cyrillic before and after learning Russian, or the change in the experience of seeing pine trees before and after learning to identify these trees. According to Siegel, we can intuitively accept that there is like an overall phenomenological difference before and after acquiring the relevant knowledge to these cases. Now, let's take a look at an aesthetic case. Consider now the changing the experience of seeing, in this case, Robert Motherwell's elegies to the Spanish Republic before and after learning, among other things, that they were painted as lamentations following armed conflicts in the 20th century. Now, as in the previous cases, we can accept that there is an overall phenomenological difference between our experience the first time seeing the painting E1 and the second time, or our experiencing the painting before learning these facts and after learning these facts. In this case, however, Siegel's contrast argument takes on a different force, because after learning about the elegies' historical context and semantic content, there is a shift in the aesthetic properties that feature in our experience. So while in E1, the painting seems severe, in E2, it seems mournful. In the aesthetic case, however, this difference in phenomenal character becomes a desideratum at the center of any theory of aesthetic perception. Any worthwhile account of how we attribute aesthetic properties needs to be able to explain and maintain this phenomenal difference. So it is in light of this that aestheticians have assumed aesthetic perceptualism. Now, of course, given that aesthetic properties are high-level properties, we immediately run into problems. As high-level properties, aesthetic properties do not belong to the low-level features that are paradigmatically associated with sense modalities. So for instance, with shape and color for vision, or volume and pitch for sound. So while we undoubtedly perceive the painting's low-level properties, such as its lines and its colors, right, it is far from clear that we can actually perceive as such its dynamism, for instance. Now, going back to Siegel's argument, Siegel moves from that first intuition to this other premise about overall phenomenal contrast. And she claims that if the overall experience of which E1 is a part differs from the overall phenomenology of which E2 is a part, then there is a phenomenological difference between the sensory experiences E1 and E2. Okay, so what is the debate on perceptualism about? Indrek Rayland formulates it in a very helpful way. So he says that the debate on perceptualism is about whether the events that give us access to at least some high-level properties are phenomenologically on a par with the events that give us access to low-level properties. In light of this, the challenge for aesthetic perceptualism, therefore, is not only to show that aesthetic properties feature in perceptual experience, but to show that the events that give access to the phenomenology of these properties are on a par with those that give access to low-level properties. Okay. So let's take a look at some features of aesthetic properties that make them particularly good candidates to feature in perceptual experience. Okay, firstly, let's start with the claim that aesthetic properties are high-level properties that depend on low-level properties of objects. Now, of course, some aesthetic properties like beauty or, let's say, beauty, might seem to more clearly depend on other aesthetic properties like ebullience or depend on power, for instance, rather than depending directly on some low-level non-aesthetic property. So we can identify a kind of hierarchy among aesthetic properties. We have predictive aesthetic properties, which concern the overall aesthetic merits of an object like beauty or ugliness that depend on substantive aesthetic properties like, as I said, ebullience or power, right? Now, some of those substantive aesthetic properties, in turn, ebullience and power, that might also include, an evaluative component, depend on other baseline descriptive substantive properties like, for instance, dynamism. And these baseline descriptive properties like dynamism depend in turn on low-level properties of objects like colors and shapes. This hierarchy makes salient another important feature of aesthetic properties. Note that baseline aesthetic properties are not primarily aesthetic terms, but they are terms that have primarily non-aesthetic uses. So aesthetic properties are peculiar because although they are properties defined in relation to a specific evaluative realm, they have non-aesthetic counterparts. Aesthetic properties stand in continuity with these non-aesthetic counterparts in that they are causally related to them. So perceived aesthetic properties are causally related to perceiving non-aesthetic properties in that we perceive aesthetic properties because we perceive non-aesthetic properties. So for instance, we perceive aesthetic dynamism of a painting because we perceive the non-aesthetic dynamism of everyday objects, such as, for instance, moving cars. Now, insofar as they depend, as aesthetic properties depend on low-level properties of objects, they are Gestalt-like or emergent. They arise when low-level properties are perceived organized in specific ways, but are still irreducible to this. Moreover, because aesthetic properties are brought into perceptual presence when low-level properties are perceived under specific configurations, they depend on other cultural, epistemic, experiential, and even emotional factors. So if aesthetic properties are Gestalt-like in that they are brought into perceptual presence when we perceive low-level properties of objects under given structured configurations, the key then to how aesthetic properties are perceived lies in how low-level properties of features, low-level properties or features are perceived organized in specific ways. Also, because they are causally related to their non-aesthetic counterparts, an argument for aesthetic perceptualism can take off from an argument for how non-aesthetic high-level properties might feature in perceptual experience. Okay, so given these features of aesthetic properties, we think that an anticipatory approach can come in handy and explain how they can feature in perceptual experience. Now, the specific view we have in mind is something that brings together the sensory-motor theory of perception and predictive processing, because that's fun. Okay, so let us start with some features of the sensory-motor theory. Now, this theory aims to explain that what enjoys perceptual presence for a perceiver does not correspond entirely with what impinges our senses at a time. So there are many phenomena that fit with this description, and here we focus only on one of them, on what Alvanowi calls the phenomenon of perceptual presence in absence, right? Which is the sense of presence of unseen aspects of an object or of a scene, right? So for instance, the back of a tomato or the back of a bottle of water. Right? The sensory-motor theory explains that sense of presence by thinking of perception as something done by the perceiver that involves sensory-motor knowledge. Namely, knowledge of the way sensory information changes as a consequence of movements and interactions, either of the perceiver or of the objects perceived. Now, this sensory-motor knowledge has the following features. Right? It becomes richer as perceivers interact with their surroundings and become more familiar with them. It incorporates aspects that are specific to certain sociocultural contexts. And finally, it is agent-dependent. According to this view, perception consists in the deployment of a set of perceptual skills, and it has an anticipatory nature or character. The idea is that sensory interactions manifests that perceivers anticipate the availability of the different features of the scene or object perceived that can be brought into presence. So perceivers anticipate the back of the bottle, right, or that the bottle has a back. The sense of presence of these unseen features is due to these features being virtually available. Okay. Now, a feature that is relevant for us from the sensory-motor theory is that it kind of seems to make room relatively easily for the representation of at least one kind of high-level properties. These are affordances. So let's consider the dual content view defended by Noy. According to this theory of content, perceptual experience features appearance or P properties. These are properties that correspond to subproximal stimuli that change continuously and that depend on the specific location, angle, and time of the perceptual episode. But it also features intrinsic properties of objects. Right? Moreover, the idea is that intrinsic properties that feature in perceptual experience feature in experience in virtue of P or appearance properties. So that perceptual experience has the content it has is underwritten or supported by perceiver sensory motor knowledge. For instance, a coin seems circular insofar as it affords certain interactions. So it seems circular if it's the kind of thing that if one were to move like kind of from side to side, it would reflect an ellipsis in the retina. Now, one worry with that is that given that affordances are agent dependent, they are way too limited to support the wide range of properties our experience can feature at times. Right? And one way to address this is to bring together the sensory-motor theory with predictive approaches, right? With predictive processing. So let's turn to that. Now, very, very roughly, predictive processing takes neural activity to be driven by top-down predictions or by top-down processing rather than by bottom-up sensory data. The idea is that rather than being driven by the processing of incoming stimuli, perceptual processing is driven by a prediction of the most likely cause of sensory stimuli. Now, this prediction in turn is generated on the basis of a multi-layered generative model that is deepened or enriched over time as perceivers interact with relevant stimuli. Now, within this approach, sorry, I'm getting stuck with my own cable. Within this approach, the content that is represented in perceptual experience is due to the wide variety of expectations that are supported by the generative models. Now, these generative models involve information from several sources, right? They can incorporate proprioceptive information, they can incorporate associated multimodal sensory information, and they can incorporate affective interoceptive information. So Our idea is that marrying the sensorimotor theory with predictive processing makes perceptualism more plausible, since the anticipatory mechanisms that explain that low-level properties feature in perceptual experience would explain that certain high-level properties feature too. The resulting view of perception we get after doing this is the following. So firstly, perception is an active phenomenon that is driven by perceiver sensorimotor expectations. These expectations may have interactive, affective, and multimodal components. There it is. Third, these generative models that support expectations differ in depth, as some of these models are enriched by our interactions. And finally, these expectations are marked by our interactions with a social cultural world. This will become very relevant. So, according to this view, perceptual content is underwritten by perceivers' expectations, and this view is consistent with perceptualism since it allows that the same kind of states that give us access to low-level properties are the states that give us access to at least some high-level properties. Now, there are at least two concerns about the resulting view, okay? First, the first concern is that kind of bringing these two together, the sensorimotor theory and the predictive approach, brings perception way too close to imagination, right? So the worry would be that, the worry, at least for us, would be that we have not in fact defended perceptualism, but we have actually defended this other view called experientialism, which is the view that some high-level properties feature in the content of our experiences, but this is due to perceivers' contributions that are, for instance, recognizably imaginary. The second worry is that even when we have made the case for the representation of some basic affordances, other more interesting high-level properties are due to these other imaginary contributions. Now, for us, this is not so much a concern. This is actually a feature of our approach, that the interplay between recognizably perceptual and recognizably imaginary contributions of the perceiver partly explains the richness of perceptual experience. And to motivate that view about the interplay of the two, we review a set of objections advanced by Kind to Noy's account of perceptual presence. Okay, so Kind's arguments depend on a couple of puzzling cases. Okay, so compare firstly the perceptual presence of the back of a can of Coke that is sitting on your desk while you're working. Compare that with the experience of that can of Coke as it is stored in a fridge far away from you. Okay, if we were to follow Noe's story, the back of the Coke on your desk enjoys a certain degree of perceptual presence that is underwritten by practical knowledge of the sensory consequences of, for instance, kind of moving your head around to bring the back of the Coke into view. However, Kind argues we are in possession of relevant sensorimotor knowledge to bring both the back of the can of Coke on top of your desk into view, but also to bring the can stored in the fridge to view. And yet the Coke in the fridge does not enjoy any perceptual presence. See now, let's turn now to the second puzzling case. In the second case, Kind asks us to imagine attending a talk with an eminent speaker, right? And the speaker is delivering her presentation from behind a lectern, leaving her lower body out of sight. Now, at a point during her presentation, the speaker steps out of the lectern, revealing that, in contrast to her conservatively tailored blue jacket, she's wearing these bright orange high-top sneakers, right? Now, according to Kind, there's an overall phenomenological change following this realization. More importantly, it is difficult to explain this change by referring solely or at all to sensorimotor expectations, right? Because before and after you saw the speaker's bright orange sneakers, the same, sorry for the rhyme, the same sensorimotor contingencies were at play. And one could have deployed the exact same sensorimotor knowledge to bring the speaker's shoes into view. Now, in light of these examples, Kind argues that perceptual experiences, content, and character cannot be reduced to perceivers' sensorimotor knowledge. According to her, what is doing the work in these cases is objectual imagining. So the presenters' sneakers, for instance, continue to enjoy a sense of presence even when they are out of view, because they are brought into what Kind calls phenomenological presence imaginatively. And the idea is that something similar would explain the case of the Coke. So she says that working in tandem with our perceptual capacities, our imaginative capacities contribute to our perceptual experience by making unseen features of objects seem present. We believe actually that Kind is partly right. Expectations in the shape of sensorimotor contingencies sometimes seem insufficient and inadequate to account for the richness of perceptual experience. But we think that sensorimotor expectations and object imagining are mechanisms that are working together. Now, sensorimotor expectations are characterized by something very particular. This is explained by the notion of bodiliness. By this, we just mean that sensorimotor expectations are characterized by their connection to current sensory stimuli. So the idea is that not all sensorimotor expectations are relevant in explaining the richness of any given perceptual experience, but rather only those that are immediately connected to current sensory stimuli and that are relevant to the way that given stimuli can be modified continuously as the agent interacts with the environment. Now, this explains why visualizing the Coke in the fridge doesn't contribute to its perceptual presence at all, even if the objectual imagining might have some phenomenological presence, and even if we are in possession of some set of skills that would allow us to go and retrieve the can from the fridge. The case of perceptual presence of the presenter's orange sneakers behind the lectern reveals that there is an interplay of imaginative capacities and sensorimotor expectations. Now, in this case, imagery of the orange sneakers is making salient that certain sensorimotor expectations that were irrelevant before are relevant now. So before the speaker stepped out from behind the lectern, we were focusing on attending to her presentations. So while indeed the same sensorimotor contingencies are at play, some of those contingencies were actually kind of in the background. Now, once the orange sneakers have perceptual presence, right now, once we know about them, even when they are out of sight, they have this presence because we expect that if the speaker were to move to one side, or if we were kind of sneak a peek, the shoes would become visible. So objectual imagining changes our sensorimotor relation to the speaker in that it makes certain expectations relevant and brings them to the foreground. Additionally, objectual imagining also changes or might also change our affective relation to sensory stimuli. So in the case of the sneakers, the possible interactions made salient by visualizing them mean now that we see the speaker as, for instance, approachable. Our imaginative capacities are surely making an important contribution, but this doesn't go against the idea that sensorimotor expectations are at play. So as Kind says, our imaginative capacities work in tandem with sensorimotor expectations and their bodiliness. So for objectual imagination to structure perceptual experience, it needs to remain attached to current sensory stimuli. So in other words, objectual imagination matters, so to speak, for making the relevant expectations salient, but it needs to maintain the connection to between the agent and her immediate environment. Okay. So anticipatory views of perception leave us with a view according to which the content of perceptual experience overcomes the underdeterminacy of sensory stimuli by means of perceivers' expectations. In some cases, however, attending to sensorimotor expectations alone is not enough. What Kind shows rightly is that our imaginative capacities become relevant in overcoming this underdeterminacy by constraining the relevant sensorimotor and affective interactions that will in turn structure sensory stimuli. And now turn to the last section. So how does this help explain how aesthetic properties feature in perceptual experience? Recall now that firstly, aesthetic properties depend on low-level properties of objects and have a hierarchical structure, so that baseline aesthetic properties ground more complex aesthetic properties that might also include an evaluative component. Secondly, baseline aesthetic properties have non-aesthetic counterparts on which they causally depend. And thirdly, aesthetic properties emerge when low-level properties of objects are perceived organized in certain ways. This is how aesthetic properties are brought into perceptual presence. Now, according to the anticipatory view of perception, the representation of low-level properties is underwritten or supported by perceivers' expectations about sensory consequences of our movements. The idea is that some high-level properties are similarly underwritten by expectations. So for instance, we might go from the expectation that an object might break to this object seeming fragile. Aesthetic properties are brought into perceptual presence when low-level properties of objects are perceived organized in specific ways. How they are organized, though, is manifested in how they are, for instance, visually explored. Perceivers' expectations provide an organization under which low-level properties are perceived, bringing aesthetic properties into perceptual presence in turn. So for instance, when we perceive elongated figures in a painting, their shape kind of directs us to expectations associated with that shape, right? So for instance, rapid movements. The expectation of seeing objects diffuse as they move rapidly organizes our perception of low-level properties, and we come to see those elongated figures as dynamic. Now, as aesthetic objects become more complex, so their low-level properties are organized by richer and richer expectations. It is at this point that the predictive take on the sensorimotor theory becomes relevant. So recall that although important expectations relate to sensorimotor consequences, these are often insufficient to account for the richness of our perception. So low-level properties might be organized by expectations about objects' interactions, about the association to stimuli from other sense modalities, or about perceivers' affective dispositions. So in these more complex cases, different sources of sensory information, as well as different features of stimuli available to the perceiver, are organized differently, constraining the interactions that are subsequently invited. Additionally, some more complex expectations that involve subjects' relation to their specific sociocultural environment might also become relevant. A consequence of this view is that when perceiving aesthetic objects, we don't have a straight line that takes us from low-level properties to simple motor predictions that bring high-level properties into perceptual presence. On the contrary, what we have is a complex cascade of expectations at different levels that meet information that corresponds to low-level properties. These expectations provide a structured organization under which complex high-level properties in turn are brought into presence or are perceived. Okay. Now, given the complexity of the aesthetic case, however, the deployment of our imaginative capacities plays a more robust role than in non-aesthetic cases. Think now to the case of the presenter's sneakers, right? In that case, bodiliness played an important role. So while the imagery brought to phenomenological presence, constrained and made salient certain interactions. So for instance, those that would bring those orange sneakers back. Current sensory stimuli continue to play a determinant role. Now, by contrast, in the aesthetic case, the attachment to current stimuli is loosened. Available interactions are less characterized by what we call bodiliness. So while current sensory stimuli serve as an anchor, our imaginative capacities are given more free rein because our expectations go beyond immediate sensory context, right? So the deployed interactions and salient expectations that structure perception of low-level properties here are not those that might be evoked by a stimulus in non-aesthetic circumstances. Our imaginative capacities provide us with cascades of expectations that might not have been available in non-aesthetic interactions with the objects, opening in this way the door for low-level properties to afford richer and more complex interactions, which can in turn structure properties of objects in different ways. So the richness of these imagined interactions that provide richer and more complex expectations to structure low-level properties of objects is what has led many to regard these aesthetic properties as untranslatable. Now, note too that these cascading expectations at different levels of complexity also depend on the aesthetic practice in which we encounter the object. If we think like Walton that art categories are perceptually distinguishable ways of classifying artworks, the category in which we perceive the aesthetic object will determine the expectations that will be activated or that will be invoked when perceiving low-level properties of objects. Similarly, depending on the specific aesthetic context in which the experience is given, certain low-level properties might be associated with the specific expectations. While there is a wide variety of aesthetic properties, we believe that they can be accounted for by attending to this growing complexity of expectations that are activated by low-level properties and that we find in different cultural practices. The case of aesthetic properties that are straightforwardly descriptive and that are connected to action properties is easily explained by attending to their non-aesthetic counterparts. So for instance, we said before that elongated figures invoke rapid movements and the expectations of those rapid movements that are associated with a shape, and that as a result, we perceive dynamic figures, right? Things that these expectations are only a small part of the cascade of different expectations that have varying complexity and that might be evoked by different low-level properties of objects. So let's turn to an example. Consider, for instance, Picasso's Guernica. We do not simply perceive the painting as dynamic on account of the presence of, for instance, elongated figures, right? But the contrasting black and white and the angular shapes invoke certain expectations related to, for instance, bluntness and starkness. So as a result of the interacting expectations associated with these properties, with dynamism, bluntness, and starkness, we perceive the painting as violent. Now, this relates to expectations in other sense modalities, which might be associated with the processing of stimuli in the current or the relevant sense modality, which might allow us to explain other cases of descriptive aesthetic properties. So some low-level properties of objects might activate expectations in a variety of sense modalities. Let's go back to the painting. In this case, the open mouths of the screaming figures invoke auditory expectations so that figures are perceived as loud, right? At the same time, though, the black and white palette might invoke expectations related to a lack of sound, right? So that the painting is in turn perceived as muted. So the result is that the painting might be experienced either as numbing or as deafening. Now, when it comes to explaining aesthetic properties with an evaluative character, we need to look at how expectations at different levels interact. The evaluative charge comes from a positive or negative affective balance when we find coherent or discordant expectations that are satisfied or not satisfied by different aspects of the aesthetic object. So going back to Guernica, instead of regarding the lack of color as lifeless, the way expectations associated with the black and white contrast interact with expectations activated by other low-level features of the object that lead to perceiving the painting as violent and deafening. So the interaction of how its features satisfy the expectation it invokes leads to the painting being perceived as striking. Evaluative aesthetic properties emerge from the expectations activated too by the painting as an artistic object. So as an artwork, we expect that Guernica maintains attention and sustains our interaction with it. If these expectations are met on the basis of other aesthetic properties, so for instance, being disturbing, violent, devastating, or deafening, the painting will be perceived as powerful. If these expectations are, however, not met, the painting will be perceived as dull. Okay, so finally, anticipatory accounts of perception can also help in accounting for other affective and expressive aesthetic properties. So recall that anticipatory approaches to perception acknowledge that affective information is coded in generative models. So as we interact with aesthetic objects, affective states will also shape expectations that provide the structure configuration under which aesthetic properties are brought to presence or are perceived. And this is how we might come to perceive objects as having specific affective aesthetic properties. So, for instance, we perceive Guernica as disturbing and devastating because that's the affective response that follows from the expectations invoked by the violence of brutality, which in turn is grounded on certain low-level features. And from the paintings, and of course, also from the painting's semantic content, right? So for instance, the devastation of war. Now, this doesn't mean that we come to perceive the painting as disturbing or devastating because we actually come to feel disturbed or devastated as a result of engaging with a painting. What it means,
just letting you know you got about 5 minutes now.
Oh, excellent.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all, thanks. So what this would mean is that affective expectations are invoked from certain features of the aesthetic object. These expectations, regardless of whether they become actualized in an emotional response, provide the structural configuration under which aesthetic properties are brought into perceptual presence. So we perceive Guernica as devastating, regardless of whether we are actually moved to tears, for instance, right? Okay, excellent. So we come now to the concluding remarks. So today, we have argued that aesthetic properties feature in perceptual experience because low-level properties of objects are organized in certain ways by our expectations, right? This is due to perceiver, sensorimotor, and affective expectations. Anticipatory approaches to perception serve as the basis for the brand of aesthetic perceptualism we defend. These approaches argue that the content of perceptual experience overcomes the underdeterminacy of sensory stimuli by means of relevant expectations. So while in non-aesthetic cases, expectations are characterized by their bodiliness, in aesthetic cases, our imaginative capacities bring forward interactions that are not exhausted by their connection to current sensory stimuli. Now, given the conception of perception we present here, there is a sense in which this view provides a version of what Heather Locke calls a sui generis view of perception, which is a sui generis view of perceptualism or of the experience of high-level properties, which is the view that high-level properties can be experienced via an amalgam of sensory, imaginative, and emotional capacities. And we think that that still deserves the label of perceptualism because of how anticipatory views of perception conceive of the relation between perception and other mental states. These approaches blur the line between perception and these other mental states. So ultimately, whether aesthetic properties are brought into perceptual presence as a result of the interaction of sensory, imaginative, and emotional capacities kind of seems beside the point. Aesthetic properties are perceptible because of the interplay of anticipatory mechanisms. Cool. Thank you. And if you have any questions about references, and so they should be there. Okay, let me stop sharing.